Друзья, всем привет.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Спасибо, что нашли время из кучи треков.
Thank you for finding the time
Собственно, мы с вами
and visited this particular track
поговорим
out of many
одной
others.
довольно важной вещи.
We'll talk about quite an important thing.
Если вы посетили уже какие-то доклады на PhD,
And if you have been around here at PH Days, you may have probably noted that a lot of people talk about attacks, and there are more sophisticated and less sophisticated attacks, and threat actors use a variety of tools to implement them. But if you were to look at it from the point of view of the business that defends itself against those attacks, then from the business viewpoint, it is a bit easier. What is most important for the business is to make sure that there is no damage from these attacks. The actual implementation of the attacks is less important. So today I will talk about a threat-centric approach and what you need to start using such an approach in your organization, and how the application of such a threat-centric approach can help you a lot in defending yourselves against real cyber threats and avoiding real damage. A few words about myself very briefly. I'm Oleg Skulkin. I'm head of preventing external cyber threats at ByZone.
Схожими направлениями. Больше 14 лет я занимаюсь цифровой криминалистикой, реагирую.
I have been in digital forensics and incident response and cyber intelligence for more than 14 years. I wrote a number of books. Some of them received international accolades, and I am a big proponent of a threat-centric approach. I like to analyze what real threat actors do. And in general, I think this is a very promising approach to leverage the resources of the blue team and the red team to strengthen security with a focus on real-world attackers. So that's my brief self-presentation. Let's now talk about avoiding real damage from cyber attacks. Talking about threat-centric approach. We're not talking about some hypothetical attacks that might be implemented against an organization, but we're rather talking about real threat actors who have specific motivation, who have specific goals, and who can do real damage to your organization. Those could be cyber spies that want to get access to private data or some of your IP, or those could be financially motivated threat actors that want to get access to your resources and use special software to ask for ransom. So we're talking about real threat actors, and we're talking about some real damage to an organization. We're not talking about any hypothetical attacks. To avoid this damage, first, we need to understand whether these threat actors exist. So who, if at all, can attack our organization? For clear reasons, this is not enough. Once you've established that, you've got to establish how those threat actors would want to attack our organization, what methods and what tools they would use. There's a multitude of those. And if we say that we want to be protected against everything, there's very little probability that we'll be able to do so. But if we can prioritize our resources and focus on what's really relevant, on what is used by real threat actors right now who are active in our region and maybe in our industry, then things become easier, because here this already gives us a limited set of
как можно
tools and
представить, это в
methods.
целом, когда мы строим ландшафт угроз для организации, да, мы
We
выделяем
build
какие-то,
a threat
например,
landscape, and we identify
которые активны.
APTs
Например,
that we know are active.
про threat intelligence мы их называем
Talking
кластерами
about
активности,
threat
потому что всё-таки
intelligence,
мы
we call them
подразумеваем
activity
людей
clusters
каких-то,
because these are
подразумеваем
not so
некоторый
much specific
набор,
individuals
технических
as
индикаторов, там, методов,
some
инструментов,
technical
и так далее,
indicators,
которые
methods,
позволяют нам
techniques,
определить, что
etc.
вот это
that
и вот это, собственно,
help
одна и
us
та же
understand
группировка,
that
потому что есть
this and that are one and the same APT.
Соответственно, когда мы говорим про то, что нам нужно понять, вот,
So when we talk about understanding of who attacks us,
кластерах активности,
we are talking about activity clusters
которые мы уже видели
that we have already seen
в рамках своей инфраструктуры. Ну, например,
in our infrastructure, such as phishing emails, for example. We understand that these phishing emails have a link to a particular APT, and it becomes clear that this APT is interested in an attack on our organization. Or there might have been incidents that we have been able to detect in our organization, and we understand that this relates to a particular activity cluster, and thus we understand that they are active and they are targeting our organization.
Если мы говорим про тех, кого мы еще не видели в
Next,
своей организации,
talking about those that we haven't yet seen in respect of our organization. We know that there are other organizations, say we are an industrial organization, we know that there are other industrial organizations in our business. And they, as our partners, let us know that they have seen this and that activity. So this broadens the list of activity clusters for us, and this helps us add to our threat landscape. We know that, okay, these are the groups that we have seen, whose activity we have seen. These are the groups whose activity our counterparts in the industry have seen. And there's another aspect of the threat landscape. That is the APTs in general that target our geography. Talking about financially motivated hackers, for example, often it is not that important for them what kind of an industry you have. If we talk about ransomware, they don't distinguish that much between industries. So we see groups that may be active in our region. There's a regional level threat landscape. The threat landscape in Russia, for clear reasons, is quite different from the threat landscape in Europe. So in terms of the methods and tools that threat actors use, there will be quite a big difference between us. And if you use public intelligence data, you want to keep in mind who publishes those reports, where that organization or vendor is located, and what industry they operate in, because there's quite a high probability that what's described there has no bearing on your threat landscape, in your industry, and in your geography. Okay, trying to respond to the question how threat actors attack us. Again, we may say that we don't proceed from our threat landscape, we don't proceed from who is attacking or will attack us, or rather, we might cover everything. And this brings us to the very well-known MITRE attack matrix with techniques and sub-techniques, and we may want to establish where we are covering everything, which may be problematic. And we can say that, okay, so we have put together a threat landscape, we've got the information of how the threat actors operate, and so
тактиками, техниками и процедурами
our TTP map somewhat evolves and starts to look something like this. There would be TTPs that would be most frequently used by threat actors in our geography, and this gives us an understanding of what we should pay attention to first, in terms of prioritization, to make sure that these real threat actors that are real and that are targeting our region and industry, so that we were able to prevent them once they want to attack us. We can disrupt them and their activities early.
Соответственно, если мы говорим про методы, понятное дело, что
Talking
когда мы
about
понимаем,
methods
как
or
именно они
TTPs,
действуют, мы можем
when we
данную
understand
информацию, собственно, прекрасно
what they
использовать
do,
для того,
we can
чтобы
use this information
сфокусировать наши ресурсы, которые
to
обычно
focus
ограничены,
our
разумеется,
resources that are, of course, limited
актуальном.
on
И,
the
соответственно, как я уже сказал, это позволит
most high
либо
priority
предотвратить,
things.
либо вовремя
And
обнаружить
this would
злоумышленника
help us to
реального, ну и,
either
соответственно,
prevent
не
or
дать ему
identify
довести
the real threat actor
кибератаку до конца,
and to
а,
prevent
соответственно,
them
если он не
from
может довести кибератаку до конца, он
carrying
не может
through
нанести
their attack. And
организации
if they can't
ущерб.
carry through their
Ну, на
attack,
самом
they
деле,
cannot
тут,
do damage
этот
to
тезис довольно
the organization.
понятный, но,
Well, this premise
скажем
is
так,
quite
а если
straightforward.
вот говорить про самих
But
злоумышленников,
what if,
могут ли
or rather, let's talk
организации,
about the
сами
threat actors
злоумышленники
themselves.
помочь
Can the threat
защититься от
actors
них же?
themselves
На самом
help
деле могут.
protect against them?
Тут как раз мы
And in
говорим
fact,
уже не
yes, they
про
can.
то, что мы
And
можем
here,
видеть из каких-то threat intelligence
it's
источников,
not
то, что мы
something
можем
that we can
видеть
find
из,
in threat
например,
intelligence sources,
расследований инцидентов,
not something
которые
that we can
были в нашей
find in the
организации,
incident
в
investigations,
организациях
whether in our
отрасли.
organization or otherwise, or elsewhere in the industry. Threat actors have to communicate. And if we were to look at the threat landscape, quite often
таким моделям, как
threat actors
вредоносное ПО как услуга,
would
программное
use models such as malware as a service or ransomware as a service, and they quite actively communicate on shadow resources. It could be
они взаимодействуют
Telegram channels
форумы, сейчас даже
or
бывают
specialized
форумы,
message
которые
boards,
посвящены определенным типам атак.
forums. There are fora that are dedicated to particular attack types, using ransomware, for example.
Отдельный форум, на котором
So they would have a special forum where there would be a thread on ransomware, for the very simple reason that they were not allowed to discuss that on any other forum.
Такие теневые ресурсы, мы можем получить
And if we monitor such shadow resources,
собственно, ряд
dark web resources, we can find answers to questions
упростить обнаружение и
that
того самого
could make it easier for us to do detection and thus prevention. Say there's certain malware that is distributed through dark web. It may not be used in real attacks, it's just that the threat actors have put up an ad on a dark web resource saying that I've got certain malware that I'm prepared to sell, and here are the features. When we get information about the features of this malware, we can match this information
техники и, возможно, даже процедуры, которые реализуются этим вредоносным программным обеспечением,
regarding the TTPs of this malware, to what extent and how they can be detected by the tools that we have available. Talking about threat actors that sell exploits of certain vulnerabilities, or want to organize a supply chain attack, or an attack on a contractor, we can use this information to see whether the software that the threat actors are going to exploit is my organization using it, the contractor that they want to exploit, whether I'm using that contractor. So when the threat actors proceed to actual attacks, you will be prepared. Sometimes threat actors sell access to compromised infrastructure. And there are threat actors that specialize in getting initial access. They don't do attack development, but they can sell initial access to other threat actors. And if you monitor relevant resources, you may find not necessarily your organization, but an organization in the industry. And you can see that, yes, threat actors are interested in your industry, and then you drill down into the technical details of the attack and use that in practice. Or that might be your contractor or your organization. This is not widespread in Russia. More frequently, access is being sold to foreign companies. But looking at past years' experience, there are saw ads of selling access to companies located in the CIS, the Community of Independent States. Another use case, talking about leaks, and they are quite numerous, those should be monitored as well, because there you could see credentials of your employees, and they often use the same passwords.
Каким-то бизнес-приложением и получение конфиденциальных данных, либо, возможно, вообще получение доступа к IT,
or get access to the IT infrastructure.
какое-то развитие атаки. Ну, если посмотреть на примеры,
Let's look at some examples.
тут как раз примеры с вредоносным программным обеспечением.
This is an example with a malware.
В феврале 2023 года
February
появилось
2023.
о продаже стилера, который назывался White Snake.
There was an ad on the sale of a stealer called White Snake,
Даже позиционировал его не как просто стилер,
and the developer positioned it
программное
not
обеспечение
as just a
для
stealer,
реализации целевых атак.
but as software for targeted attacks. Indeed, it had a lot of features related not just to the stealer, but also to getting persistent access to a compromised system. And there was quite a detailed discussion of the features to understand how it functions even without having a sample available. In February 2023, this
собственно, реальных атаках, ну, мы, как появилось объявление наших заказчиков, повестили о том, что вот есть
started to be used in real attacks, and we notified the contractors that it is there, that certain TTPs are implemented using it.
потому что, естественно,
And then in March they started
там запрещена работа по России.
using that.
Но мы увидели, что его используют для атак на различные зарубежные компании.
We saw that it's being used for attacks on foreign companies, and there was a web-based version and a Linux version, and both versions were used. So in June 2023, this malware started to be used
атак на территории Российской
for
Федерации.
attacks in Russia.
Таких довольно неплохих и связанных со шпионажем.
Quite sophisticated ones related to
Соответственно, еще в феврале
quite well orchestrated. So we could understand back in February what features the software has, and to understand to what extent
хотя бы можете эти тактики, техники и процедуры обнаружить, и, соответственно,
you could
в
be
июне уже
secured against this malware and the TTPs there. And so have you looked at this in February, then in June you would be quite well covered.
инструментах атакующих.
So you want to gather information on the TTPs of the attackers to be more protected. But this is not enough. It's a good first step, but it's certainly not
для того, чтобы действительно был определенный эффект.
You've got to take some practical steps
чтобы это действительно
to
начало помогать вашей организации
have some persistent effect.
собственно, этого самого ущерба избежать. Ну, опять же, не стоит считать, что все вот нужно обнаруживать где-то.
And again, it's not that
в любом случае могут преодолеть там любые средства защиты.
you should try and detect everything, that threat actors can overcome any means of protection. That is not so. 99% of all threats that you're going to come across
чем вы должны их
should be prevented rather than you will detect them in your infrastructure. So talking about the threat actors, the methods, the tools, etc., IOCs, they can be used to prevent the threats. Talking about IOCs, I think it's quite straightforward. You want to look at many typical use cases. For example, threat actors have to work with the the compromised infrastructure. And if you know their infrastructure, if you know the IP addresses, then you can proactively block them. And even if the malware gets into your system, they would hardly be able to do anything because they won't be able to control it.
Здесь, конечно, сложнее немного, но тем не менее, когда мы говорим, например, про инструменты, в том числе легитимные, которые используются злоумышленниками.
Okay. Sometimes threat actors use some legitimate tools, and if many of the tools like that are not to be used in your infrastructure, so you can use some file indicators to block these tools, and when they try to use them, if they make it to your infrastructure, they will try make a noise, because these tools are not going to work, so they'll have to look for some other tools, some new tools, and this way you'll be able to at least identify this guy.
И, собственно, если мы говорим про информацию о методах,
talk about the information on the methods and tools as a whole, so you may reduce kind of the chances of these tools to be used. And here we have a broad range of ways to mitigate this. It depends on the specific method or technique. And so we can have a look at the infrastructure. So if you see that some interpreter of the scenarios is not used or shouldn't be working, so you can use this data, this information on how threat actors use this or that technique to make it as difficult as possible for these threat actors to kind of work in your environment if they, for some reason, make it there. We can also talk about vulnerabilities. There are many of them. Every day we see new vulnerabilities being added to the list, and so we have a lot of them. But if we look at the vulnerabilities where we have public exploits, then the list is squeezed big time. And out of these vulnerabilities, not all of them are used by threat actors. And we're talking about threat actors because they can cause damage. Then, if we talk about vulnerabilities used in real attacks, and this is public, or if threat actors discuss vulnerabilities on some shadow platforms, and it is likely to be exploited in the near future, so this further reduces the list, and that's how we can use this information for prioritization. So, to begin with, we fix the most topical issues, the things which are being used by the attackers, and then we deal with what we have some public exploits available for, and then we cover the rest. Okay. As you remember, we had 1% remaining, so 99% can be prevented, but unfortunately, we always have this 1% left we cannot prevent, so the attackers may get access to the IT infrastructure of the organization. And the important thing here is that we can timely, at the earliest stage, identify the threat actors, because we know how they behave and what they do, and this way the attacker will not be able to succeed in the attack. And we will prevent the damage this way. And so here we are focused on threat-centric approach, so we know the methods and tools of the wrongdoers, and this way we will use cyber intelligence for this. And it has to be gathered. Okay, talking about the compromise indicators, we can use some fresh indicators to retrospectively look into some things, say maybe our tools have missed something, we didn't have indicators in the past, but now we do have them, and maybe we can find some traces of wrongdoing. Then we develop some detecting logic, if it kind of makes sense, and it depends on really what you use, whether you have any protection, and what you kind of have to develop your own identifying tools. But we should understand how these tools tools are implemented in the real cyber attacks, and we use this information to be confident that we can find what the kind of threat actors are using today. And then if we kind of talk about the overall legitimate things, all the things which may be legitimate, when we cannot kind of code rule to identify this type of activity, then we can use the data on the tools and methods of threat actors to develop hypotheses to look for threats proactively. Well, otherwise, we cannot do because threat actors are using now too many legitimate tools. Okay, here is an example. We have some infrastructure indicators. So if this is a targeted attack, so now we are talking about a specific group of hackers. So we get indicators related to this group, and we could retrospectively see whether we had some communications in the infrastructure which could be related to this type of attacks. Then we have some detecting content. So here is a rule for the planning
инструмент, который злоумышленниками используется для проксирования.
So they use this
нетипичная совершенно активность, если вы видите, что у вас
to launch the payload. So if you can see that in your planner we have tasks like that, so 99.9% probability is that this is related to activities. So this is the difference between threat hunting and detection engineering. And in the threat hunting, it looks like that. So the threat actors, they use the Python interpreter quite actively, and they launch different scripts, and they are usually in the folder of program data or subfolders. So the hypothesis is that in this infrastructure you might have some scripts which could be used by the threat actors, and they're not detected by your tools. And then within this proactive search, you look for all the things available, you analyze them, and you kind of see whether there is anything malicious there or not, any malware. And another important thing is threat identification. And this is something which usually lets the incidents be carried out to the end, because organizations like missing this stage, identification. Okay, we have some alerts, we have a compromised workstation. So what do they do? They just kind of reset it to default. Okay, so why this happens? So the threat actors were doing something quietly. They used some malware which was identified for some reason. Then the organization kind of goes to the recovery stage by kind of resetting this machine, so that the threat actors understand that they've been identified, and then will try to be more quiet. They'll change their tactics and procedures, or they may speed up to cause some damage, understanding that if they've been identified here, they're most likely to face some response. And if we look at any incident, when we start investigating it, and when we look at the logs of your antivirus, there you can see a lot of alerts which were ignored by the organization. So, like your protection tried to tell you that things are bad, but since we didn't have enough knowledge, we didn't have enough context in this, as a result, the incident ended up badly in damage. Okay, talking about threat identification. So we could use cyber intelligence. So we have some notifications from our
получить контекст, как этот контекст
protection tools, the ISS,
вот таким образом.
for instance. But then we can enrich this. So how do we do it? Maybe we have some connection to the command server. We identify it, and we see that it's related, like it's an identifier of a given group. Then we understand that they're using some specific methods and tools, and then we have enough context to further kind of dig into this incident. Okay, here's another example. So we have the some malware domain with some malicious connection. So then we take the data from cyber intelligence and then we convert this domain into the specific group, using it as an element of infrastructure. Then we understand that, okay, they gain initial access through using spear phishing. They use PowerShell for going further down their cyber attack life cycle, and then we have some other indicators we might use to look for some network connections and some malware files in the infrastructure which were likely missed beforehand.
Ну и опять же, всегда важно
Another important thing is to test whether we are secure. We obtain data related to the threat actors' activities, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we should go and start developing some response rules and so on. Sometimes you should just take the information of the tactics and procedures of your threat actors and to see whether your kind of security toolkit is capable of identifying this kind of activity, and secondly, whether your team is capable of coping with this. Okay, we have cyber intelligence. Say we know that these wrongdoers are using some legitimate tools and some malware, which has some behavioral markers. This can be used to simulate some similar activity, and then we can say, okay, we have telemetrics, and we can see how kind of we respond to this. Okay, say, can my antivirus or some other tool identify this malicious software? Okay, we say some virus total placed virus file, and do we have the detect there for the antivirus I'm using? Or you can run a virtual machine with your protection toolkit, put this file there to see whether you'll have alerts or not. So it's usually easy to simulate. So talking about tools, usually it's much more straightforward, because you can simulate the use of some tools you might download it from GitHub or another website, because they usually use legitimate tools like remote access tools, some tunneling tools, and this can be used to see whether you've got telemetrics, whether you have the attacks with the toolkit you have. And talking about the procedures, if you know how wrongdoers implement their strategies and techniques, you might also simulate their behavior and see how your response toolkit works. And the most important thing is that your team should see how a given process or how a given attack life cycle or kill chain element is implemented, so that they see what it looks like and respond to this and prevent any damage.
Опять же, если мы хотим
Summing up, if we don't want any real damage to be caused by attacks, so we are talking about external cyber threats, well, I understand that we'll have to pay to the red team for the pen test.
понимать,
Well,
что
you
вот
should
этот самый
understand
графический подход,
that
когда мы
this
понимаем,
threat-centric
как
approach,
именно
when we
действуют реальные
understand
злоумышленники,
the
причем не
behavior of the
просто
real
какие-то
threat
абстрактные,
actors. And they shouldn't
конкретные,
be
если мы
abstract, they
берем,
should be
собственно,
specific.
наш регион,
Like
да,
we should look at our region,
это,
and we
разумеется,
should talk about
значительно вам
specific
поможет
wrongdoers.
защитить вашу
So this
организацию
will
от этого
really
и
help
таким
your
образом
organization
ущерб не пустить.
protect
Если
itself.
говорить про то, откуда эти данные брать, тут
Where
как
to get
раз
this data
ваш
from?
главный помощник
Here
это
we are
киберразведка.
talking about
Опять же,
cyber
есть
intelligence.
много чего и
There are
продуктового, есть много чего и в
many
открытых источниках.
things
Соответственно, все это очень
available
важно
in the open
использовать. И это будет,
sources
собственно, вашим
or in the
маяком,
product
который
descriptions,
поможет
and
вам
this will be
подсветить
your
именно то, именно самое важное, на что в
guiding
первую очередь
light
вам внимание нужно,
to
собственно,
highlight
обратить.
what you should primarily focus on.
Ну и, соответственно, если вы подобный подход внедряете у себя,
If you introduce this kind of approach, it will really help you prevent cyber attacks, even forecast them, because through your threat landscape, you will see what is going to be done by these threat actors tomorrow, and if they breach your environment, you'll be able to properly respond if, well, you have to respond. And this will let you
такие реальные кибератаки останавливать.
stop these cyber attacks at the earliest stages. This will prevent damage to your company. That's it from me. If you want to learn more about our approach, please scan this QR code. They will have the first chapter of quite a lot of information on all the practical use cases I have mentioned. They will see some details, so this will be the first part. You are welcome to begin there. That's it, and I'm here to answer your questions.
Олег, большое спасибо за интересный доклад. У меня следующий вопрос.
Oleg, thank you very much. Really exciting. I have a question.
Представлена некая сегментация группировок.
We saw a slide segmenting the groups of attackers who attack us, our partners in our industry. And then, understanding this stack of groups, we can take the next step and have a heat map
Раскладки по митере. Вот. И у меня вопрос следующий.
and also slice and dice it following the metro methodology. Do you think we should have several heat maps with this type of segmentation, so that we get several metro-related heat maps for those who attack us and attack the partners and the industry? Do you think one heat map will be enough for us to see the priorities? Okay, thank you. It depends on the resources available. You might build one heat map, like you will have the core, like the most important things, and things you can see, and then you may use it to develop your map in terms of the methods and tools, and then we can talk about the tactics, techniques, and procedures. So when you add this kind of pieces to your core, they just supplement each other. So you have the first and second and third priorities, but that's like just the way you described it. You start with something small, and then you expand this further. Maybe you'll have a great coverage, and the team will understand all this so well that you might go even beyond this. So you start with the 3 levels, but there might be, say, a dozen of them. Like you cover all your geography, and then you start covering some adjoining geographies. Maybe you have branches in some kind of nearby countries, and so on. But you have some overlapping anyway. We are talking about priorities here. So if you have some white spots, so you can add some more kind of layers to cover all these white spots. Thank you very much.